Emily lay on the hospital bed, her body drained of strength, barely able to move. Her body was cold, as if a part of her had already begun to leave this world. Her skin had become pale, almost waxen, and even the simplest movements brought her unbearable pain. Every breath, every exhale reminded her of the battle she had been fighting for months. She knew her strength was leaving her. The room seemed gloomy. Though the windows were open, no light penetrated the space. The sun's rays, which usually brought warmth, avoided her bed. The doctors examined her coldly, already knowing that there was little hope. Everyone was expecting one thing, that she would not make it through the night. But Emily's parents, stubborn in their despair, refused to accept this fate. They had taken her to an unusual place, a hospital that few people spoke about, and when they did, it was with fear. This hospital had a sinister reputation. The building stood on the outskirts of town, hidden deep within a dense forest. It resembled an ancient castle, with large windows and cold stone walls that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. Locals often whispered that the hospital was cursed. Old-timers recounted stories from their childhood of mysterious disappearances of patients who were never seen again after crossing its threshold. Emily's parents had heard these stories, but, in their desperation, decided they were just superstitions. The hospital promised one thing: healing from any illness. They believed it was their daughter's last hope. From the moment they entered, an overwhelming sense of dread began to seep in. The corridors were empty, and every footstep echoed as if from another reality. Nothing about the place felt right, but they chose not to believe the worst. The doctor who greeted them seemed too calm, almost indifferent. He guided them to Emily's room, made a few dry remarks, and left, offering no promises of recovery. Emily's mother clung to hope, although her intuition whispered otherwise. She couldn't shake the feeling of fear every time she looked at the staff. Nurses moved like automatons, avoiding eye contact with patients, their expressions distant, like puppets devoid of life. Days passed. Emily seemed to be getting better. Her parents were relieved but also began noticing strange things. They were no longer allowed to visit her as often, being told it interfered with the treatment. The doctors said little, offering vague explanations, and visits from other patients were strictly forbidden. Then one day, the doctor called them into his office. His voice, cold and detached, delivered a final blow. "Your daughter didn't survive the night." Emily's body was given to them for burial, with no further explanations. The funeral was arranged quickly, almost as if following some hidden script to which they had no access. Grief-stricken, her parents couldn't bring themselves to question the situation. They didn't know that their daughter was still alive. When Emily woke up, the first thing she felt was cold. Not just a physical cold, but the kind that seeps into your bones, tightening every muscle. Her lungs strained for air as her hands instinctively tried to move. She knew something was horribly wrong. She was confined, surrounded by wooden walls. Fear slowly, like a thick fog, engulfed her mind. She tried to raise her hand, but her fingers brushed against the hard surface above her. Her fingertips ran across it, feeling the rough texture of wood. She was in a coffin, buried alive. Panic surged through her. Her heart raced in her chest, pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Her breathing became sharp and uneven. She started to scream, but her voice was muffled, strangled by the dirt that surrounded her. No one could hear her, and that made the terror even worse. Her hands pounded against the coffin's lid in desperation. Every strike seemed pointless. Her cries were swallowed by the earth. Emily wept, banged, whispered prayers she could barely remember from her childhood. Her hands began to bleed from the brutal contact with the wood, but the coffin remained unyielding. Despair wrapped around her tighter with each passing second in the suffocating darkness. She had no sense of time. An hour? 2? Maybe days? But then something changed. She heard a sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a shovel breaking through the dirt above her. At first, she thought it was a hallucination. She fell silent, straining to listen. Then the sound came again. Someone was digging. The person outside worked fast. Emily, gathering every ounce of strength left, began to pound again, though her arms were weak. Every knock felt like her last, but she continued. Finally, the earth above her began to shift. The coffin lid creaked open, and she saw slivers of moonlight. Standing above her was a figure, dressed all in black. His pale face was expressionless, and his eyes were empty, devoid of life. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said, his voice eerily calm. Emily wanted to scream, but something in his voice paralyzed her. His deep, cold eyes stared into hers with an unbearable emptiness. She knew at that moment that the danger surrounding her in the hospital hadn't disappeared. No, it was only just beginning. Emily's parents learned the truth too late. They began to suspect something was wrong when other families started sharing similar stories. But the truth was far more terrifying than they could ever imagine. The hospital wasn't for healing. It was a front for a dark cult that offered its patients as sacrifices to the earth. Everyone who had been buried in its grounds had been alive, their bodies used in horrifying rituals. Emily's father couldn't bear the weight of this guilt. His heart shattered under the pressure of his own self-blame. He couldn't forgive himself for trusting the doctors, for bringing his daughter to a place that had stolen her life. He broke under the grief. Her mother, left alone, was consumed by despair, unable to cope with the horror of what had been done to her family. The hospital, however, continued to accept new patients. Its cold stone walls held a secret that no one dared uncover. Only those who passed by its grounds felt an inexplicable unease, as though the earth beneath their feet whispered stories of those who would never return.